How's it going, my bakers? I hope you're having a great day. Welcome to another episode. Today, I'm going to show you just how resilient sourdough starter is and just how difficult it is to kill one. So let's go to the kitchen and do some experiments. If you have kept a sourdough starter for a while, this kind of sight will be very familiar to you. You leave your starter in the fridge, you go on vacation, you come back, and you find it looking a little bit weird. It may have separated in layers with a strange looking liquid on top, which could be grey or even black. The starter may be smelling quite acidic. All of this is totally normal. That liquid layer on top is called hooch. It is produced by the yeast once it runs out of food. It's kind of like a cheap acidic alcohol. Some people like to drain it off, but it's totally safe to be mixed back into the starter. Someone who may not be experienced with this may think that something's really wrong, while in fact this hooch acts as a protective layer on the starter. Being acidic and mildly alcoholic, prevents anything from growing on top of it, especially mold. Hooch doesn't just appear when you refrigerate your starter. It can also happen when it's kept at room temperature. It just means that the starter is very hungry. Perhaps you should change the ratios or feeding schedule. Now this normally just happens with liquid starters. I've never had a low hydration starter leaking hooch. So if your starter is asking for food, you should probably feed it. Flint here has been in the fridge for several months. And the way I like to bring him back to life is to feed him at a 1:1:1 ratio, which is equal parts starter, flour and water. This gives it a fair amount of food so it can come back to life quite quickly. So I'll cover this up and leave it on the table for 12 hours. And as you can see, it's rising pretty well. And once it's nice and active like this, I would feel comfortable making a leaven and start making bread. If your starter is still a little bit slow, you may want to feed it again at a 1:1:1 ratio. And it will definitely come back to life after a couple of feedings. And I would always suggest feeding it once it's risen already. Don't just refresh a starter that hasn't risen. That would just dilute the yeast and the bacteria and make it take even longer. So if yours hasn't risen in 12 hours, you just leave it for another 12 hours, or for however long it may take. You want to wait for the yeast and bacteria to multiply. If you have kept a sourdough starter for a while, you will know how resilient it is. You will know how easily and quickly it comes back to life. The main reason why I'm making this video is to show that a starter is pretty hard to kill. I would even go as far as saying that you can't kill it accidentally. You could kill it on purpose, but that would just be pointless. This one will be for all the bakers who have thought or told me that at one time or another they have killed their starter. To which I say, no, you didn't kill your starter. You just didn't feed it properly, or you just didn't persist. And to prove that a starter is pretty much indestructible, I'm going to do something extreme. Note the color of my skin. Let's check the date. It's the 18th of April, 2022. I'm about to go on vacation. And I'm going to leave my starter on the kitchen counter at room temperature until I come back. It's all fine when it's refrigerated and slowed down, right? Leaving it at room temperature might just kill it, but we'll see. Okay, I've just come back from India, and my ultimate goal of turning into a brioche loaf has been achieved. But the starter, on the other hand, does not look very good. There's kind of like a dry layer on top of it and bubbles all over it. It looks almost veiny and stringy. Let's check the date. It's the 11th of May. So this thing has been sitting on the table for more than 3 weeks. Let's inspect it a little bit more closely. First thing I can say, it does not smell bad. It's acidic, like a starter should be. But it does look like the surface of the moon. I think it's kind of cool. Right before you say, Charlie, your starter's moldy, get rid of it. No, it's not. It is covered by a type of aerobic yeast, which forms when nutrients are depleted. It is the same wild yeast that's in the starter, just in a different form. Kinda looks like pudding, right? It's not as tasty, trust me. But how do you tell mold apart from this? Mold is not normally white, that's one thing. It could be black, grey, green, or even pink. But the main way of telling them apart is that mold smells very different. It has this musty and stale smell, kind of like old socks. I know sometimes people like to refer to the smell of a starter as being like old socks. To that I say, don't confuse old socks with smelly feet. Starter smells acidic and pungent, not musty. Okay, so this isn't moldy, but it might be still dead. I had never kept a starter at room temperature for so long without feeding it. Let's just see how long it takes to bring it back to life. I was trying to be a bit cocky here, and I wanted to build a leaven and make bread with it right away. So this is mixed at a 1:5:4 ratio. 1 part starter, 5 parts flour, 4 parts water. So I've diluted the bacteria and the yeast, if there's any in there. It should prove a challenge for it to rise up again. Now while I'm making this, let me remind you that each of my videos comes along with a written article, which you can find on my website, linked in the video description. I always write down all the details and things that I may have forgotten to say here, so it's always worth watching the video and reading the article. Okay, so as you can see, the starter is very sluggish. The main reason I suspect is because I didn't feed it at a 1:1:1 ratio. You can see that it came up a little bit. That was after the camera stopped filming. The time-lapse only records for so long, but that's fine. We'll leave it to sit for another 12 hours. And it's sprung back to life, as it should. This is now ready. I'm confident that this will make a nice leaven and will result in a nice loaf of bread. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to mix this again, let it rise up. It'll take only about 10 hours, and then we'll make some bread. And if you want this exact recipe that I'm going to make, you can find it also linked in the written article. And no, you don't need to use a neglected starter to make it. So I'm not going to talk you through the steps here, as ever. This is not a recipe video. What we will talk about is why the starter is so indestructible, and what's it made up of, and what goes on inside it. It starts its life as just flour and water, both of which separately don't really do much. When we mix flour and water, we try to create an environment in which the wild yeasts and bacteria can thrive. If you're lucky enough, your starter will become bubbly and active in just one day, but it can take up to 2 weeks. We're trying to make those wild yeasts and lactobacteria multiply. People sometimes treat it as this mythical thing, but there's really nothing special about it. The yeasts are everywhere. Most notably, they should be in the flour. Sometimes people like to add grated apples, grapes, pineapple and other stuff to their starters. While it is true that there's yeast on those fruits, it may not be the yeast that we want to be in our starter. Since we want the yeasts to ferment the flour, it should come from the flour. Fruit like that can be used for nutritional value, to feed the yeasts, but it's by no means necessary. All you need is flour, water, consistent feedings and time. There are 2 kinds of inhabitants that we want in our starter, which are wild yeasts and lactobacteria. Each of them is in charge of things that the other one requires. The lactobacteria produce lactic acid and acetic acid, both of which lower the pH of the starter and make it acidic, and that is what gives sourdough bread its sour flavor. But more importantly, an acidic environment is unfavorable for bad bacteria. The wild yeasts, however, thrive in this environment. On the other hand, yeast produces alcohol, ethanol. The lactobacteria do not mind this alcoholic environment, while other bacteria do. To top it all off and tie it all together, yeast releases enzymes, which convert starches to sugar. Both the yeasts and the lactobacteria feed on those sugars. And this is symbiosis. They both ensure their own and the other one's survival, and they create and dominate an environment that other bacteria do not like to live in. The lactobacteria in a starter can outnumber the yeast at 100 to 1. It is the same principle that is used for fermenting vegetables, like sauerkraut, kimchi or pickles. An acidic environment eliminates pathogens like enterobacteria and staphylococcus. Mold should not be able to grow in a starter unless it's heavily contaminated or exposed to it. Using clean utensils and practicing good personal hygiene is key. The same acidity that prevents mold growth on a starter translates to our bread. I have never had a loaf of sourdough bread go moldy on me. It only goes stale. Of course, if you do something silly like leaving it in a very moist environment, of course it will go moldy. But under normal circumstances, it won't. So let's get back to my super neglected starter. I used fresh flour and clean utensils to make it. I covered it so it was airtight. It had plenty of food to last for a while, and it would have been active for quite a few days. As the enzymes kept converting starch to sugar, the yeast and the bacteria kept on feeding on it. Once there was no more starch to convert, the sugars ran out. That made the starter even more acidic. That is what prevented from any bad stuff from growing on it. Now I don't know quite the process of how the yeast turns into that weird white stuff, but apparently it is the result of starvation. Should you treat your starter like that? Of course not. I just wanted to show you that it's very hard to kill your starter. The next time you think that you may have killed your starter, you can look back at this video and think again. Of course, if you see signs of mold or suspect it, then you should throw it away and start over. The sentimental value is not worth getting sick over. You can make a new starter very quickly. Some people like to keep a little piece in the freezer in case the worst happens. Some people spread it thinly on a piece of paper and dry it out and turn it into a powder. That can easily be brought back to life too. And again, that proves how resilient the starter is to different treatments. And as you can see, even after being neglected so much, just after 2 feedings, it has produced great looking and great tasting bread. And I hope you found this useful or encouraging, or both. So what do you think of this experiment? Have you ever thought that you killed your starter? Let me know down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, click over here. Subscribe to the channel, click right here. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.